She shared her last sips of water in the desert, not knowing he was her long-lost son. The desert stretched endlessly before Rae, its heat a tangible thing that gnawed at her skin, making each step feel like a battle. Her boots crunched against the dry, cracked earth, and the weight of her pack threatened to crush her, but she had no choice but to keep moving. She'd completed her contract weeks ago, helping a disgraced ex-diplomat escape a hostile planet. Now she was alone, navigating the desolate expanse on a personal mission that had consumed her for years. She wasn't expecting to find answers here, but she had to try. This was the last planet on her list, the last place where she might find him. She had been searching for Callan for almost 20 years. A name whispered between the stars, linked to a tragedy that had nearly destroyed her. She had told herself 100 times that she was doing this for closure, for justice, but there was something deeper, something that pulled her toward him with an undeniable force. She had lost him once. She wouldn't lose him again. The wind kicked up dust as Callan trudged through the harsh desert, his body breaking under the weight of his exhaustion. The last few days had been a blur of pain and thirst. His squad had been wiped out in an ambush, a swift, brutal attack that left him as the only survivor. The dead were just that, dead. And now Callan was just a ghost, wandering through the ruins of his past, nothing but a shadow of who he used to be. His throat was dry, cracked. The last of his water had evaporated hours ago. His stomach twisted in hunger, but that was the least of his worries. The real threat was the sun, the relentless heat, and the sinking feeling that no one was coming to help him. He collapsed to his knees, coughing hard, trying to gather what little strength he had left. The desert seemed endless, and so did his suffering. But then a faint figure appeared on the horizon. His vision blurred, but he could make out enough to know it wasn't a mirage. Someone was out there. He staggered to his feet, desperation fueling his movements. Was it a rescuer, a scavenger, a threat? He had no idea, but he needed to know. He stumbled toward the figure, his limbs heavy and uncoordinated, like his body had forgotten how to function properly. The figure grew closer, and he saw a woman, weathered, strong, moving with the confidence of someone who had survived countless hardships. She was alone. She wasn't in a hurry, and that somehow made him pause. He hadn't expected to encounter anyone out here, especially not someone like her. She didn't seem like the kind of person who would be caught out in the desert, unprepared. Something about her felt familiar, but he couldn't place why. Maybe it was the way she moved or the way she carried herself. She wasn't like the others he'd seen before. Her eyes met his, and for a moment something shifted in him. There was a recognition, or at least a sense that he should recognize her. His heart quickened, and a strange pull tightened in his chest. But no matter how much he searched his mind, he couldn't understand why. Rae spotted him from a distance, but she didn't believe what she was seeing at first. A man, stumbling across the dunes, his face covered in dirt and exhaustion. He looked as though he had been wandering for days, just like she had. But there was something about him that made her stomach twist. As he got closer, she could see the faint outline of scars across his face, and his body was lean and hard, worn down by time and trauma. She couldn't help but notice how familiar he looked. There was something about the way he held himself, something she couldn't put her finger on, but she didn't have time for questions. She wasn't here to make friends or figure out where he had come from. She was here for her own reasons. Still, there was a magnetic force that seemed to draw her toward him. It unsettled her. She didn't want to feel anything, especially not some strange, inexplicable connection. "Hey," she called out, keeping her voice steady but low. "You need help?" He stopped, scanning her with eyes that seemed distant and hollow. "I'm fine," he rasped, his voice a rough, dry whisper. But she could see the desperation in his gaze, the signs of someone on the edge of collapse. "No, you're not," she said, stepping closer. You're about to pass out, and if you don't get water soon, you won't make it much longer." She moved closer to him, instinctively reaching for her canteen, but he stepped back. There was something about the way he reacted, tense, guarded, like he didn't trust anyone. "Don't bother," he muttered. But she could hear the weariness in his tone. "I'll be fine." The words weren't convincing, and his posture made it clear he wasn't fine. Rae didn't push. She simply tossed him the canteen. If he didn't want help, that was on him, but she couldn't leave him out here to die alone. After a few moments of silence, he cracked the cap and took a long, shaky gulp before handing it back to her. Their hands brushed briefly as she took it, and for a split second she felt that tug again, that strange, unshakable feeling. "I'm Rae," she said quietly, trying to break the tension. He nodded stiffly but didn't respond. "Silas," he said after a beat. His voice still rough, but there was something else there, a flicker of something, recognition, or perhaps just the start of a deeper understanding. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but she couldn't deny it. "Where are you headed?" she asked, trying to steer the conversation. He shrugged. "Nowhere, just surviving." She raised an eyebrow, skepticism evident in her voice. "Surviving doesn't usually work out well in a desert like this." He glanced back at her, meeting her gaze for a second longer than necessary. "Maybe not, but I'm used to it." There was a pause, a shared silence between them, filled with the weight of something neither could fully comprehend. "All right," she said, adjusting her pack. "Then let's survive together." The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. Rae's boots dug into the shifting sands, each step a battle against the relentless heat and the exhaustion that had been creeping in since the first day she'd set foot on this planet. Her water supply was running low, but the tracker on her wrist told her she was close. Her gaze flickered over to Silas, who had been walking silently beside her for the last few hours. His face was gaunt, sunken, and caked in dust, but there was something about him, a hardness that caught her attention every now and then, like he was a man who had seen far too much. He wasn't just wandering, he was lost. A man adrift with no anchor, and that in itself made her uneasy. Still, she had to admit, they'd fallen into an easy rhythm together. Rae didn't ask questions, and Silas didn't offer answers. They had both seen too much pain to waste time with small talk. The silence between them was comfortable in its own way, the quiet of shared loneliness. As they reached the edge of a rocky ridge, Rae paused. The dimming light cast strange patterns across the land ahead, a patchwork of red and gold, the endless horizon marked by jagged mountains. She could feel the weight of the moment settling in. One wrong turn, one misstep, and they would be trapped here for who knew how long. "We're close," she said, more to herself than to Silas. She checked her wrist again, confirming the signal from the remote base she was heading toward. It was a low-rent station, hardly worth mentioning, but it would provide shelter and enough supplies to get her to the next planet on her list. Silas didn't respond, but she saw the way his eyes lingered on the horizon. He wasn't looking at the station, not directly. His focus was somewhere else, as if the planet itself had some kind of magnetic pull on him. She wondered what demons he carried, what made him so restless. They started walking again, but something in the air had changed. Rae's instincts, honed from years of survival in the wilderness, told her they weren't alone. She had long stopped trusting the stillness of the desert. Too many times she had walked into a trap with nothing but her gut and the wind at her back. Then she heard it, a low, muffled sound, like something shifting in the sands. Her hand moved to the blaster at her side, fingers tightening on the grip. She wasn't sure if it was a predator or another wanderer, but she wasn't taking any chances. Beside her, Silas stiffened, his posture suddenly alert, every muscle in his body coiled like a spring. He didn't speak, but Rae could feel the tension radiating off him. It was as if his senses were keyed into the environment in a way that was almost unnatural. She stole a glance at him, wondering what kind of man he was underneath the dust and blood-streaked clothes. A soft hiss broke the air, followed by a low mechanical rumble. It was a speeder, its engine purring as it came into view on the ridge. The sand kicked up around it, momentarily obscuring the driver's identity. Rae's hand tightened on her blaster. The speeder came to a stop before them, the pilot's face hidden behind a dust-streaked visor. The moment the speeder halted, Silas took a step forward, his movements fluid and fast. Rae barely had time to react before he had already crossed the distance between them, his body tense and poised. She instinctively backed up a step, watching him closely. She had seen people like him before, trained killers who moved without hesitation, who sized up a situation in seconds and made decisions with the sharpness of a blade. Silas wasn't just wandering. He was a predator, in control, and that unsettled her more than anything. "You lost or just passing through?" the figure in the speeder called out, voice distorted by the wind. Silas didn't answer. He just stared at the man, his eyes sharp and cold. Rae was about to speak up when she noticed the shift in the air. The strange, undeniable connection between her and Silas. There was something familiar about him. Maybe it was the way he moved, the way his eyes studied the terrain like a man who had survived wars, or maybe it was just the way their paths had converged. But there was something, an odd feeling she couldn't shake. Her heart thudded in her chest as she watched Silas. Who was this man who had been through so much and yet still stood before her? A shadow of a life that was obviously denied him. She didn't know. Not yet. But something told her they weren't finished here, not by a long shot. The silence between Rae and the speeder pilot stretched on, thick and heavy. Silas didn't budge, still sizing up the man who was now eyeing him warily from behind his visor. Rae glanced back at the speeder, noting the weapon slung on the stranger's hips. Another mercenary, or perhaps a bounty hunter? Either way, she wasn't in the mood for a fight. But Silas was already moving, his hand outstretched toward the stranger's weapon belt. It happened so fast that Rae barely had time to process it. One moment he was standing still, and the next, he had the pilot's blaster in his grasp, twisting it out of its holster with ease. The man's hands shot up in surprise, clearly not expecting such a move. "Easy, pal," he stammered, but there was no fear in his voice. He wasn't rattled, just annoyed. "I'm not looking for trouble." Silas didn't lower the weapon. His expression was unreadable as he leveled the blaster at the pilot. Rae could sense the barely contained fury beneath his calm exterior, the kind of rage that had been buried for years. She knew that rage. She'd seen it in the eyes of soldiers, in the eyes of survivors who had been through the grinder and come out the other side a little broken. "What's your deal?" Silas's voice was low and dangerous, his tone leaving no room for games. He wasn't the type to ask twice. The pilot seemed to hesitate for a moment, then shrugged, his hands still raised. "Just doing my job. Thought I might help you two out. You look like you're running low on supplies. Thought you could use a ride." Rae stepped forward, keeping her eyes on the pilot. Something didn't sit right about this. No one was that generous in the middle of nowhere, not without a catch. "We're good," Rae said flatly. "Don't need help from a stranger." But the pilot was persistent, giving them both an insistent look. "You're making a mistake, trust me. I know people who can get you what you need. Fast. I'm just passing through, but I could do with a little company. What do you say?" The moment stretched on, tension building between the three of them. Silas's grip tightened around the blaster, but then, as quickly as it had flared up, his tension seemed to dissipate. He lowered the weapon slowly, though his gaze remained sharp, never leaving the pilot. Rae wasn't sure if it was the pilot's nonchalance or Silas's sudden shift in demeanor, but she felt a strange tug inside her. It was the same feeling she'd had earlier, something intangible, like an invisible thread pulling them together. only now it was stronger, more insistent. The pilot seemed to notice the shift too, but didn't say anything. Instead, he muttered a few curses under his breath, then powered up the speeder. "Suit yourselves," he called over his shoulder. "I'll be around." As the speeder disappeared into the distance, Rae and Silas were left alone again in the vast, unforgiving desert. Rae glanced at Silas, but he was already walking, his footsteps steady and determined, as though the encounter hadn't even happened. She followed without a word, the silence returning between them. Yet, despite everything, there was a lingering question in the back of her mind, a question she couldn't quite shake. The way he had reacted to that pilot, there was something familiar in it, something she couldn't pinpoint. They walked for what felt like hours, neither speaking nor acknowledging the strange bond that seemed to exist between them. It wasn't just survival keeping them together anymore, it was something else, something neither of them was ready to confront. But when they reached the base at long last, it was clear their journey wasn't over, not by a long shot. The desert sun was relentless, burning their skin despite the thin atmosphere of the planet. Rae wiped the sweat from her brow and pushed forward, her boots crunching on the cracked ground beneath her. Silas was a few paces ahead, moving with the same mechanical precision he had shown earlier. It was as if he was in a race with something unseen, driven by a need she couldn't quite understand. Her eyes narrowed as she watched him, her mind wandering back to the strange feeling she'd gotten earlier, the way he had reacted to that pilot, almost like a man who had been in situations where every encounter could be the last. But there was more to it than that, something she couldn't place. The more she observed him, the more she felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into a void she couldn't comprehend. "Silas," she called out, her voice cutting through the oppressive silence. "How long have you been out here?" He didn't stop walking, but his head turned slightly, acknowledging the question without fully answering it. "Long enough?" "Long enough for what?" He didn't respond immediately, and Rae bit back the urge to press further. They had a mission, after all: find food, find shelter, and get off this godforsaken planet. Yet something in her refused to let the question go. Maybe it was her need for answers, or maybe it was the way he was always so distant, like a man who carried the weight of the galaxy on his shoulders. "Why are you really here, Silas?" she pressed, her voice softer this time. "I mean, we both know this isn't just about survival. There's something else you're running from, or running toward." Silas stopped walking, his back to her. The muscles in his shoulders tensed, and Rae thought for a moment he might turn and walk away. Instead, after a long, tense silence, he finally spoke. "I don't run from anything," he said, his voice tight. "I've learned the hard way that running never solves anything. You just end up further from where you want to be." Rae bit her lip, considering his words. She had never been one for running either, not since her days in the military. But she knew all too well what it felt like to be lost, trapped between the past and whatever future awaited. She didn't know what had broken him, what had driven Silas to this life, but she was beginning to think it wasn't just the war or the mercenary work. "You don't have to tell me anything," she said, her tone gentle now, almost as if she were trying to offer some comfort. "But I can tell something's eating at you. I'm not asking you to share your whole story. I just don't want you to shut me out completely." There was another pause, longer this time. Silas turned to face her, his eyes shadowed, the harsh sunlight doing little to mask the fatigue and scars etched into his face. He looked like a man who had been through hell, and maybe even come out worse for it. She could see the weight of years on his features, and yet, beneath it, there was something more. A flash of vulnerability that flickered for the briefest moment before it was buried again. "I've already told you too much," he muttered, his voice hardening once more. "I'm here because I have nothing left to go back to." Rae studied him closely, the pieces of his story slowly falling into place. She could see it now, the way he carried himself, the way he reacted to situations. He wasn't just a man running from a war or from the wreckage of a life. He was someone who had been chewed up and spat out, only to get back up and keep moving. But even now, Rae could sense that something in him had been irrevocably broken. "Well, you're not alone anymore," she said quietly, her gaze steady. "We'll get through this together." Silas didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned away, nodded, and continued walking. Though this time there was something different about the way he moved. He wasn't quite as isolated as he had been before, not quite as closed off. The desert stretched out before them, but for the first time since they'd met, Rae felt that perhaps the road ahead wasn't as lonely as it seemed. The planet's relentless sun beat down, shimmering off the dry, cracked earth beneath their boots. Rae adjusted the strap of her pack, the weight of her gear bearing down on her shoulders, but it felt like nothing compared to the gnawing hunger and thirst that tugged at her insides. She could feel it in every step, every breath. This desert had a way of making you feel small, insignificant, like a fleeting shadow against the vastness. The wind kicked up, sending a cloud of fine dust swirling around them. Rae narrowed her eyes, scanning the horizon. There was still no sign of the settlement she had been heading towards, the place where she hoped to find answers. But the planet had a way of disorienting you. Time and direction became enemies out here, and Rae was beginning to feel its grasp tighten. She glanced over at Silas, who had been unusually quiet since they'd started walking. His posture was tense, shoulders stiff, his steps slow but deliberate. The weathered look on his face had shifted from exhaustion to something harder, something colder. He wasn't talking much, which suited Rae fine. She didn't need to ask what haunted him. She had her own ghosts to contend with. As they walked, the low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. Rae frowned, glancing up at the sky. There were no clouds, no hint of rain. That was strange for this planet. It didn't have storms in the usual sense, but there were occasional seismic tremors, dust storms, and electrical surges. Still, she wasn't willing to take chances. They needed shelter, and fast. "Silas," she called out, her voice rough from the dry air. "We need to find cover." He nodded but didn't respond. He didn't need to. The way he moved, the way he scanned the horizon, told her he was already thinking the same thing. She pulled out her map, studying the area again, trying to recall where the nearest cave systems or settlements might be. Her eyes narrowed as something in the distance caught her attention. A shadow stretching across the dry landscape. Not a natural shadow, though. It moved too fast and the angle was wrong. She wasn't the only one who noticed. "Hold up," Silas said in a low voice, his hand going instinctively to the blaster at his side. Rae did the same, her fingers brushing the cold metal of her own weapon. The ground beneath them trembled slightly, and Rae felt her heart pick up pace. Not from the storm she thought was coming, but from something else, something much worse. A figure emerged from the shifting dust, tall and menacing, its shape barely discernible at first but quickly becoming clearer. It was a humanoid figure covered in tattered armor, its movements jerky, almost mechanical. A scavenger? A rogue merc? "No," Rae muttered under her breath. The figure's silhouette was too precise, too controlled. She'd seen that kind of movement before, military. And from the way the ground shook, this wasn't just some lone wanderer. This was a group. Silas's hand gripped his blaster tighter, his jaw clenched in a grimace. "We're not alone," he said, his voice low but steady. Rae's gaze flicked to him, noticing the twitch of his muscles. He was tense, alert, but there was something else in his eyes. Something she hadn't seen until now. A spark of recognition? Maybe not for her, but for what was about to come. His body language screamed experience. He'd fought before, and this wasn't the first time he'd had to face down a group like this. She didn't ask any questions. The desert had a way of making people survive, and in this moment, that instinct was kicking in. Without warning, Silas surged forward, moving with the same controlled precision Rae had come to expect from him. His blaster was out in an instant, and Rae mirrored him, ready to defend herself. She wasn't sure who these people were, but they weren't here to be friends. The figure in front of them reached for something at its side, and that was all the signal Silas needed. His shot rang out, the loud crack of his blaster echoing across the desert, a sharp reminder that even in the harshest places, violence was a language that needed no translation. The figure staggered back, but it didn't go down. Rae's pulse quickened as the rest of the group appeared, emerging from the shifting sands like ghosts. Their eyes locked onto her and Silas, and Rae knew they weren't here to talk. The group didn't waste any time. They moved quickly, their boots kicking up dust as they circled, weapons drawn and aimed. Rae didn't hesitate. She took a deep breath, her instincts kicking into high gear as she scanned the terrain around them. There was no cover, no escape route. The only option was to fight. Silas stood at her side, his eyes sharp, focused. She could see the tension in his posture, the way his hand held the blaster, steady but ready. It wasn't just the weight of the weapon in his hand. No, it was the weight of years of experience. He was used to this, used to surviving in the worst of conditions. It was both a blessing and a curse, Rae realized, as the situation began to unfold in front of them. The leader of the group stepped forward, tall and menacing, the silver of their armor gleaming in the harsh desert light. Their face was obscured by a helmet, but the voice that came through the comms was low, grating. "You're in the wrong place," the leader said, his tone thick with malice. "This is our territory. You'll pay for trespassing." Rae didn't respond immediately. She couldn't afford to give them an opening. Instead, she surveyed the group again. At least 4 of them. Probably more hiding in the dust or in the shadows. They weren't military, but they were well trained, with the hardened edge of experienced raiders, scavengers, mercenaries. She was dealing with professionals. Silas glanced at her, his eyes narrowing as if reading her thoughts. He knew, too. This wasn't going to be a simple shootout. These were people who knew how to move, how to kill. "Get out of the way, you cretin!" the leader barked again, this time addressing Silas. "We won't waste more time with you." Rae's pulse quickened at the insult, but she kept her expression neutral. If they thought Silas was an easy target, they were in for a surprise. She knew he wasn't going to back down, not now, not ever. The leader made a motion and the group moved forward, surrounding them, closing in. Rae's heart hammered in her chest, but she wasn't afraid. She'd fought in worse conditions, and she knew Silas had too. She trusted him. They would survive this, together. The leader lunged at Silas, but Rae was faster. Her blaster was already raised, and she fired a shot that struck the leader's chest, sending him staggering back. The shot didn't take him down, but it did slow him down. Long enough for Silas to react. In an instant he moved, his blaster snapping to life with a series of quick, precise shots that struck 2 of the raiders. They dropped like sacks of shit, their bodies crumpling in the dust. But the remaining 2 were still moving, still closing in. Rae ducked behind Silas, her blaster raised, and fired a shot that struck one of the remaining raiders in the leg. He dropped to the ground with a howl of pain, but the last one was still coming. A grin spread across Silas's face as he aimed his blaster at the final raider. But before he could pull the trigger, the raider reached for a grenade strapped to his belt. "Take cover!" Rae shouted, throwing herself to the ground. The explosion ripped through the air, sending dust and debris flying in all directions. Rae shielded her head with her arms, the blast throwing her off balance, but she didn't lose consciousness. She knew better than to panic. In situations like this, you kept moving. The dust cloud cleared and she pushed herself up, her ears ringing. She blinked, trying to clear her vision. Silas was already on his feet, his face grim but unscathed. The last raider lay on the ground, unconscious, his grenade harmlessly detonated in the blast. Rae checked herself quickly. She was shaken but alive. Her hands trembled slightly as she wiped the dust from her face. "You all right?" Silas asked, his voice gruff. Rae nodded, her eyes scanning their surroundings. The threat was gone for now, but she knew better than to think they were safe. Not yet. Not in this place. The desert didn't give second chances. "We need to keep moving," she said, her voice firm. "This isn't over." Silas looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. Agreed. Without another word, he turned and began walking, his pace steady and sure. Rae followed, her hand still hovering near her blaster. The desert stretched out before them, endless and unforgiving, but for the first time in a long while she didn't feel completely alone. The desert stretched endlessly before them, a barren wasteland where the sun beat down mercilessly. Rae could feel the dry heat seeping into her bones, and her throat felt as though it might crack with every breath she took. The small supply of water she had left was almost gone, and she could see the same fatigue etched in Silas's face as he stumbled along behind her. They had been walking for hours, maybe days, it was hard to tell in the sweltering heat, and the endless dunes felt like they might swallow them whole. "Keep going," Rae murmured, more to herself than to him. Her eyes scanned the horizon again, searching for any sign of life, any sign that they weren't alone in this godforsaken place. But there was nothing, just sand, sky, and the faint shimmering of heat on the ground. Behind her, Silas muttered something under his breath, some curse or perhaps a prayer she couldn't make out. She wasn't sure if it was frustration or resignation in his voice, but either way it didn't matter. They were both at the mercy of this planet now, and neither of them was in the mood for mercy. Suddenly, a crackling noise broke the oppressive silence. Rae froze, her senses sharpening immediately as the static from a comm unit filled the air. Silas stopped as well, reaching instinctively for the weapon at his side. Rae raised a hand, signaling for him to hold off. She was the one with the comm unit. The old, battered piece of equipment hanging at her waist. She pulled it free, her fingers moving quickly to activate it. The faint static persisted, growing louder and more distinct. Someone or something was trying to communicate. "Rae! Rae, if you're out there!" The voice crackled through the static, weak but unmistakable. Ray's heart skipped a beat. She knew that voice. It was him. She hadn't heard from him in over a decade. She thought he had been dead. She thought they had been dead. But no, this was him. His voice, gravelly but still unmistakably his, cut through the static, dragging up memories Rae had buried long ago. The comm sputtered again. It's me, Rae. I don't know how, but they're coming for me. I don't have much time left." Ray's hand clenched around the comm. She didn't believe it at first. She couldn't. This wasn't possible. The man's voice belonged to someone who should have been long gone. She had left him for dead in the chaos of their last mission years ago. How was he alive? Where had he been all this time? Her mind raced, scrambling to make sense of it. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice shaking slightly despite herself. "What's going on? Who's—" The comm sputtered again, almost too faint to hear. "It's me, Rae. Aren't you listening?" Ray's throat tightened, her pulse quickening as she realized the voice was unmistakably familiar, but it wasn't someone she had expected to hear again. Her hands shook slightly, but she managed to keep her grip steady on the comm. "Eric?" she breathed, almost unable to believe it. The thought of hearing his voice again was like a ghost coming back to haunt her. The response was jagged, broken. "Rae, I need help. I'm out here in the desert and I don't know how long I've been here. Please, you've got to help me." Her mind was racing now and her thoughts were scattered. She remembered Eric, one of the few who had been with her during the war, someone who had fought beside her until the very end. But she thought he had died. She had seen it happen. or at least she had thought she had. Silas looked over at her, confusion written all over his face. "Who is it?" he asked quietly, sensing the change in her. Rae didn't answer immediately. She was too busy trying to make sense of everything. The voice on the comm, the memories of the past, the mission that had gone wrong, everything she had tried to leave behind, and yet here it was, clawing its way back to her. I don't know," she murmured, staring at the comm. "But I have to help him." Silas watched her for a long moment, then nodded. "Let's go. I'll follow your lead." Rae's fingers tightened on the comm once more. "Eric, I'm coming. Hold on, okay? Just hold on." As she lowered the comm, she turned to Silas, her mind still reeling. She couldn't be sure what had happened to Eric, or how he had ended up here, but one thing was certain. She couldn't leave him behind again. As the days passed, the desert's suffocating heat began to shift into the deep chill of the desert night. Rae huddled beneath the small shelter she'd managed to put together, her thoughts scattered, unsure if the voice on the comm was real or a mirage. But no matter how many times she replayed it in her head, it didn't make sense. Eric. Her mind insisted it had to be him, but the reality seemed too cruel a joke. Was he really still alive after all these years? She adjusted her pack and slowly stood, her body sore from days of walking through the shifting sands. Her head throbbed in the aftermath of the heat, and yet the voice, so clear, so familiar, kept echoing in her skull. "Rae, it's me, Eric." The comm clicked off again, the silence that followed pressing down on her like the weight of the heavens. She couldn't make sense of it. How was Eric alive? How could he still be out there? Rae hadn't seen him in over a decade. After the war, after their falling out, she'd lost track of him. He'd disappeared into the war-torn fringes of the galaxy. Some thought he was dead, others said he was in hiding. Rae had assumed the worst, but this was impossible. She tried not to let her emotions get the better of her. She'd been through too much to fall apart now. Her hands shook as she picked up the comm unit again, dialing the frequency once more. The static crackled in response, but no answer. She swore under her breath, feeling the familiar tug of anger rise. A long sigh left her lips, and for the first time since she'd made contact with him, her thoughts shifted back to Silas, as she knew him. She hadn't even realized how much of her energy had been tied up in searching for him, in trying to reconnect the past until now. But why had she kept going? What had truly driven her these last 2 decades? The thought gnawed at her. She didn't have the answers, not yet. Her gaze flickered to the horizon. The desert stretched out before her, endless and unforgiving. She knew there was no going back, not now. The days had blurred together under the relentless sun, the dry wind stinging their skin, the air thick with dust. Rae's mind was clouded by hunger, fatigue, and a gnawing uncertainty that she couldn't quite shake. But there was something else beneath the surface, a whisper of hope that had been too long buried. They trudged through the desert in silence, neither of them speaking much, each caught in their own thoughts. Rae's eyes scanned the horizon, and then she froze. Her instincts, honed through years of survival, picked up on something, a faint shimmer in the distance. Not a mirage. "Wait," she muttered under her breath, taking a cautious step forward. Silas paused behind her, alert. He followed her gaze. Ahead, beyond a stretch of sand, there was something unusual, a patch of greenery. It wasn't much, just a few trees and shrubs dotting the otherwise barren landscape, but it was a welcome sight. A small oasis. Rae's heart skipped. Could this be real? She didn't want to hope for too much, but the sight of water and the faint sound of trickling was undeniable. She quickened her pace, her boots kicking up the dry sand as she rushed toward the small pool. Silas moved quickly behind her, his body moving as if it were a machine, a trained reflex rather than human instinct. They reached the oasis within moments. the cool water reflecting the deepening evening sky. Rae knelt, dipping her hands into the pool and cupping the water to her lips. The coolness was almost shocking, like a balm to her cracked lips and dry throat. She drank deeply, savoring every drop. She could feel her body begin to come back to life with each sip, the raw exhaustion from days of desert travel slowly starting to dissipate. "We need to make camp," she said, wiping her mouth. Silas nodded, still keeping a wary eye on the surrounding desert. The oasis was a welcome relief, but it wasn't safe to get too comfortable. There was always a chance that this small patch of life might attract the wrong kind of attention. As Rae scanned the area, she noticed something else: small game. A few rodent-like creatures skittering about in the underbrush. Her survival instincts kicked in again. "Stay low," she whispered. "I'll take the first shot." She grabbed her plasma dart gun, the weapon a silent companion in her days of hunting and scavenging. Silas, ever the soldier, reached for his own weapon, but Rae stopped him with a look. "You don't need to make noise," she said, her voice low. "We can do this quietly." With a practiced hand, Rae steadied her aim and fired. The dart zipped through the air, striking one of the creatures cleanly. It squealed, but only briefly, before collapsing to the ground. Rae moved quickly to retrieve it. She offered Silas a quick grin. "This will be enough for tonight." They set up a small fire, the warmth contrasting with the chill of the desert night. Rae skinned the creature, quickly preparing it for roasting, while Silas gathered what little dry wood he could find. As the meat began to cook, the aroma was a small luxury, something they hadn't experienced in days. Rae tore into her portion first, the meat surprisingly tender after all they'd been through. Silas, ever cautious, ate his quietly, savoring the simple pleasure. They ate in silence for a while, each too lost in their thoughts to speak. The crackling fire was the only sound, and beneath the stars the two of them sat there, content for the first time in what felt like an eternity. But despite the momentary comfort, Rae's mind wandered back to the calm, to the voice that had called out to her, Eric. She couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone had just slipped through her fingers. But tonight, there was nothing she could do about it. For now, the desert would let them rest. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The oasis was a brief moment of reprieve, a stark contrast to the harsh desert that had relentlessly tested them. Rae crouched beside the small pool of water, drinking deeply. It wasn't much, but it was enough to wash away the grit in her throat. She let out a long, contented sigh, the cool water refreshing her in ways she hadn't realized she needed. Silas stood a few paces away, scanning the horizon with that ever-watchful eye. Even here in this oasis of safety, his vigilance never faltered. Rae knew it was more than just his mercenary instinct. This was survival. The weight of his past was in every movement, every calculated glance. It wasn't just the desert that made him cautious, it was the life he'd led. She wiped her mouth and stood, walking over to where he was standing. "We'll have to keep moving after this," she said, her voice steady. "We can't stay here too long. Eric's out there and I'd like to get to him before he runs out of luck." Silas didn't turn to face her, but his jaw tightened, the muscles in his back stiffening at the mention of Eric's name. Rae noticed, but she didn't press. She knew Silas wasn't quite as comfortable with Eric's presence as she was. "I'll prep some of the meat," Rae continued, though she knew they wouldn't be able to carry much. "The sooner we get to him, the sooner we can figure out what the hell's going on. This desert's no place for the weak." Silas nodded but remained silent, his mind clearly elsewhere. After a few moments, Rae noticed the slight shift in his posture, as though he had made up his mind. "Tomorrow morning we set out," Silas said. "We can't waste any more time. If Eric's in trouble, we need to get to him before it gets worse." Rae was about to respond when she caught the faint rustle of movement in the distance. Her hand went instinctively to the blaster on her hip, and Silas's eyes narrowed, his hand flexing near his weapon. "Predators," he muttered, his voice low and steady. "We're not alone here." Ray's heart skipped a beat as the tension rose. The desert was full of creatures that had learned to survive by hunting in packs. And with them so close to Eric's last known location, there was no telling how long they had before the predators closed in on their target. Silas glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "We need to go now. We can't afford to get caught out here." Rae nodded, already moving to gather their things. She looked once more at the water, grateful for the small blessing. It would have to sustain them until they reached Eric and the settlement beyond. There was no time to linger. They wouldn't stop until they found their friend, and the oasis of calm they'd briefly found here would feel like a distant memory by the time they reached the distant canyon. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the jagged rock formations that littered the canyon ahead. Rae led the way, her eyes constantly scanning the shifting terrain. Silas, though exhausted, remained vigilant. His senses, honed from years of mercenary work, prickled with the tension of the wilds. Every creak of shifting rocks, every gust of wind through the canyon's narrow passageways set him on edge. It was when they were almost to the base of a larger cliff that they heard it. The unmistakable sound of a struggle, muffled but desperate. Rae froze, her eyes flicking to Silas, who gave a slight nod. They both knew who it was without needing to speak. Eric. Ray's pulse quickened. Eric had been her ally through thick and thin during their time in the war, and their bond had never quite been severed despite the years apart. Seeing him again, alive, felt like the universe had decided to throw them a small mercy. But the sound of the struggle was growing more frantic. The distant growl of something animalistic echoed through the canyon, sending a shiver down her spine. Silas didn't wait for further instructions. His gun was already in his hands, his mind whirring with tactical analysis. They had no idea what they were walking into, but if it was Eric, it was worth the risk. They rounded the corner just in time to see a blur of movement. A figure silhouetted against the stone, backed into a narrow alcove, weapons drawn but faltering against the looming shapes that circled him. The creatures were massive, like nothing Silas had ever seen before. Their fur blended seamlessly with the sand and rocks of the canyon floor, a deadly camouflage that made them almost invisible in the harsh desert environment. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dimming light, a fierce yellow that gleamed with hunger. Silas's fingers tightened on his rifle. Rae was already moving, though, slipping into the shadows to take a flanking position. "Eric!" she shouted, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. "We've got your back." Eric's head snapped up, his face pale but defiant, blood smeared across his forehead. His usual confident demeanor was marred by desperation as he fended off the advancing predators, his weapon too slow to strike them down. "Get down!" Rae barked. Without hesitation, Silas dropped into a crouch, taking a deep breath to steady his aim. His eyes flicked between the creatures and their vulnerable target. They were big, nearly 6 feet tall on all fours, their limbs muscular with teeth long enough to tear through steel. Rae moved fast, too fast for Silas's liking. She threw herself forward with a fierce cry, drawing one of the predators toward her with a blast from her rifle. The pack reacted instantly. One beast lunged at her, jaws snapping, but Silas's shot rang out first, the bullet piercing the beast's skull with a sickening crack. The predator dropped, twitching in the dust. Silas was already moving, rifle unslung from his back, raised and locked in, but the alpha was on him before he could squeeze the trigger. Its claws scraped the rock, nearly taking him down. With a grunt, Silas twisted his body, ducking low as the predator's jaws snapped above his head. In a blur of motion, Rae shot the alpha directly in its exposed side, and the beast stumbled back, stunned. Silas seized the opportunity, driving his knife into its heart. The creature let out a final guttural roar before collapsing in a heap of fur and blood. With the alpha down, the other predators recoiled, circling but less confident. Rae's eyes narrowed as she readied another shot. She wasn't about to let any of them escape. "Run, you cowards!" she yelled, firing a shot into the air. The remaining predators, after a tense moment of hesitation, bolted into the desert. "Nice shot," Eric said, his voice raspy but grateful. He staggered to his feet, wiping blood from his brow. "I didn't think you'd come. Thought you were long gone after all these years." Rae's heart pounded in her chest, but she let out a breath, slinging her own rifle over her shoulder. "I never gave up, Eric, even when I thought you were." Silas lowered his rifle, eyes flicking to Eric. His wariness hadn't fully dissipated, but he had to admit that this was a guy he could trust for now. They needed him if they were going to make it out of this hellhole. "Let's get out of here. We can deal with your reunion later," Silas said gruffly. Rae gave him a quick nod, her face grim but relieved. She would deal with Eric's history later. Right now, survival was the priority. Rae focused on Eric, her hands steady as she worked to patch up his wounds. The gash on his side was deep, but the bleeding had slowed, and she used the cloth from her pack to create a makeshift bandage. His face was pale, lips cracked from dehydration, but he was alive. That was all that mattered for now. Whilst Rae was patching up Eric, Silas took the opportunity to field dress some fresh meat from the dead desert wolf and also skin it, to use as a possible makeshift shelter later on, if needed. His movements were quick and efficient, his mercenary background evident in the way he handled the task. He had done this more times than he cared to admit. Silas crouched nearby, scanning the horizon whilst working away. He was still alert, his hand never far from his sidearm despite the immediate danger passing. The desert had a way of making even the calmest moments feel tense. The last thing they needed was to be blindsided by more predators, or worse, another ambush. But for now, Eric was their priority. "You're lucky," Rae muttered as she tied off the bandage, her fingers nimble despite the circumstances. "Not many make it out of a fight with desert wolves in one piece." Eric let out a pained chuckle, wincing. "Yeah, well, seems like luck's the only thing I've got left." Silas shot a glance at Rae, then at Eric. "What happened to you?" he asked, his tone a bit harsher than intended. Eric's gaze turned distant for a moment before he shook his head, his voice low. "Ran into an old enemy. Those damn desert wolves were the least of my worries." He paused, as if weighing whether or not to elaborate. "I've been on the run for days. Thought I could outrun them. Guess I wasn't fast enough." Rae shot Silas a look, signaling him to back off. She finished with the bandage and stood up. "We've got enough to get you to the settlement," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "We can talk later." Eric gave her a nod of appreciation, even though the pain was still evident in his eyes. He didn't have the energy to argue. The journey ahead was grueling, but necessary. With Eric patched up, the trio began the final leg of their journey to the settlement. The sun was relentless, beating down from above as the winds kicked up clouds of sand, turning the horizon into a blur of shifting colors. Silas kept an eye on the rear, his instincts as a merc still sharp despite the toll the desert had taken on him. Rae led the way, steady and unwavering, her rugged experience in this environment evident in the way she moved. Eric, although battered and bruised, managed to keep up, though every now and then he stumbled, and Rae would steady him. Silas couldn't help but feel the weight of their situation. Despite the brief reprieve at the oasis, their supplies were dwindling. The food they'd hunted from the desert wolves wouldn't last them much longer, and the settlement still felt like a distant dream, buried somewhere beyond the endless dunes. But they had to push forward. There was no other choice. By the time they reached the settlement's outer boundaries, the sun had nearly set, casting a reddish-orange glow over the landscape. They were exhausted, but the sight of civilization, of lights, walls, and the distant hum of generators, was a welcome relief. "Almost there," Rae muttered, her voice hoarse with fatigue. Eric grinned weakly, the first sign of life he'd shown in hours. About damn time. Silas didn't share the sentiment. He stayed silent, eyes scanning the settlement, the edges of his senses prickling with something he couldn't quite place. The desert was treacherous, but so was life in the settlement. Nothing ever felt safe, not for someone like him, and certainly not for Rae or Eric. Still, they were alive, and that was something to be grateful for. The settlement appeared over the horizon like a mirage. At first it seemed like nothing more than a cluster of weather-beaten buildings, barely visible through the haze of heat rising from the sand. But as they drew closer, details became clear. Rusting metal, faded signage, and dust-covered structures clinging to life in a place where survival was a constant battle. Silas, still wary, scanned the area as they walked through the settlement's outskirts. There was no telling who might be watching them, and his instincts were sharper than ever. This wasn't a place where outsiders were welcomed with open arms. Rae walked a little ahead of him, still carrying her rifle, but her posture less tense than his. She'd been here before, more than once. For her, this place was just another pit stop in the ongoing quest for answers. She had spent enough time here to know that, while rough around the edges, the settlement had its uses. "I think we're almost to the supply outpost," she said over her shoulder, her voice steady. "We can get you patched up properly, Eric, and grab some supplies for the road." Eric had been quiet since they left the oasis, his pace slower but determined. He glanced at the settlement walls as they neared, his expression unreadable. He had seen too many places like this one, places that promised safety but delivered little more than survival. "You know I'm not sticking around," Eric muttered, wiping a bit of sweat from his brow. "I'll take what I need and keep moving." Rae didn't argue, though she caught the edge in his voice. She knew that look. He'd been running for so long that it was second nature to him now. Even in a place that should offer shelter, Eric wasn't ready to trust it. They entered the settlement, and the dust that clung to the air gave the place a gritty, suffocating feel. The streets were narrow and uneven, lined with makeshift stalls and tents where locals traded goods or offered services. The atmosphere was tense, as if the people here were always expecting something to go wrong, because it often did. As they passed a corner, Rae spotted an old acquaintance, a burly man with a thick beard and a permanent scowl. His eyes widened slightly when he saw her, but he quickly masked his surprise with a grunt. "Rae," he said gruffly, his voice rough from years of hard living. "Didn't expect to see you back here any time soon. Thought you were off chasing ghosts." Rae gave him a thin smile, her gaze flicking to Silas and then to Eric. "Just passing through," she replied. "Need some supplies and a little medical help for my friend here." The man's eyes flicked to Eric, taking in his wounds before he nodded. "We've got a decent medic, but if you're looking for something better, you'll have to head to the southern outpost. That place is a little more official, but if you're in a hurry, the local doc can patch him up." Rae considered this for a moment, then shook her head. "We'll manage. But I need a few other things. Water, food, anything you've got." The man grunted again, turning toward one of the nearby stalls. "I'll see what I can do. You know the price here isn't cheap, right?" Rae smirked. "I didn't expect it to be." As the big man with the thick beard gave a sharp nod and disappeared into one of the nearby stalls, leaving them standing in the middle of the street, Rae turned back to Silas and Eric. "We can rest here for a bit. The outpost isn't far from here, but it's best to regroup. We've all been through hell." Eric didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes said everything. For now, at least, they had a brief respite from the desert's cruelty. But Rae knew better than to let her guard down completely. Danger was never far away, and it never took long to find trouble in a place like this. The settlement was as harsh and dry as the desert that surrounded it. Dust choked the air, and the buildings looked like they had been patched together from whatever scrap was available. The few locals out in the open eyed them with distrust, their gazes lingering just a little too long before quickly darting away. Rae led the way, keeping her movements quick and purposeful. She knew the drill here: get in, get what you need, and get out. The less attention, the better. Silas hung back slightly, his posture still wary, while Eric continued forward without hesitation, his face a mask of exhaustion. "You okay?" Rae asked, keeping her voice low as she scanned the surroundings for potential threats. Eric gave a half-hearted shrug. "Just tired, nothing new." Rae didn't push it. She knew the drill with him. He wouldn't talk about it unless he wanted to. She turned her attention to Silas, noticing his gaze flickering from one shadow to the next, his wariness not quite masked by his usual calm. "This place feels wrong," he muttered, his voice a low rumble. Rae glanced back at him. "It's not a vacation spot, that's for sure, but it's useful for what we need. We'll be out of here soon enough." Their conversation was interrupted by the return of the burly man. He grunted as he dropped a couple of small crates at their feet, then jerked his thumb toward the nearby medical tent. "Doc's inside. If you're looking to get patched up, she's your best bet. But you're paying with credits, not favors around here." Rae nodded, her hand brushing against the small pouch of credits on her belt. "Understood. Thanks." With that, she handed him some credits from her pouch. The man gave her a curt nod before heading off, disappearing into the crowd with the same quiet urgency that defined most of the settlement's residents. Rae didn't waste time, making her way toward the makeshift medical tent. The air inside the tent was stifling, heavy with antiseptic and the smells of burn ointments and medicine. A woman in her mid-40s, sharp-eyed and graying at the temples, looked up from her work as they entered. She wore a long, faded coat that had seen better days, but the way she carried herself left no doubt. She was no amateur. "You're not from around here," the doctor said, her voice tinged with suspicion. "Got the looks of the desert on you. What do you need?" Rae spoke quickly. "We need a proper medical patch-up for my friend here." She glanced at Eric. "And something for the road, food, water. We've been out in the wild too long." The doctor's eyes flicked over to Eric's injuries, a brief flicker of recognition in her gaze. "You look familiar. Been a while since I've seen someone like you." Eric didn't respond, but his eyes narrowed as if he could see through her words. He kept his distance, his face tight with the weight of old memories. "All right," the doctor said after a moment, moving toward a supply shelf. "I've got some stabilizers, some bandages. It'll take the edge off. As for food and water, I've got a few rations, but they're not cheap." Rae tossed a handful of credits onto the table, which the doctor eyed for a long moment before nodding. "I'll get you what I've got," she said, pulling a ration pack from one of the crates and placing it next to the medical supplies. "You're lucky I've got something decent today. Things here get scarce real quick." Rae took the supplies, placing them in her pack, then nodded to the doctor. "We'll be going soon." "Good," the doctor replied, turning her attention back to her work. "People like you don't last long here if they stick around." The warning hung in the air as they left the tent, Silas giving the doctor a quick, hard look before following Rae back to the tent's entrance, whilst they waited for Eric to get patched up. Inside the makeshift medical tent, the air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and dust. The doctor, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and a steady hand, assessed Eric's injuries with practiced efficiency. She cleaned and dressed his wounds, her movements precise and quick. Eric winced but didn't flinch, his stoic demeanor betraying the pain he must have been in. "You're lucky," the doctor muttered as she worked. "Not many make it out of a desert wolf encounter in one piece." Eric didn't respond, his gaze fixed on a point beyond her shoulder. Rae stood nearby, arms crossed, watching the procedure with a mixture of concern and impatience. Silas lingered at the entrance, his eyes scanning the settlement's dusty streets, ever watchful. Once the doctor finished, she stepped back and wiped her hands on a rag. "That should hold for now. Keep it clean and dry. If it gets worse, don't wait. Come back." Rae nodded, offering a brief thanks before turning to leave. She picked up the small crates again that the burly man had left for them, handing one to Silas and keeping the other for herself. Eric, still silent, took his share without a word. They exited the tent and made their way through the settlement's narrow, sun-baked streets. The locals eyed them warily but didn't approach. Rae led the way, her pace steady and purposeful. Silas followed closely, his hand resting near his sidearm. Eric brought up the rear, his steps measured but determined. As they reached the settlement's edge, Rae glanced back once more. The place was as unforgiving as the desert itself. She didn't look forward to returning any time soon. With the settlement behind them, they turned toward the canyon ahead, the next leg of their journey stretching out before them. The journey from the settlement was grueling. The relentless desert sun beat down on them as they traversed the barren landscape. Rae led the way, her steps steady and purposeful, while Silas followed closely behind, his eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of danger. Eric, still recovering from his injuries, brought up the rear, his movements slower but determined. Days passed in a blur of heat and dust. They navigated through narrow canyons and across dry riverbeds, each step taking them closer to their destination. Rae's mind was focused on the task at hand, getting Eric the medical attention he needed and finding answers to the questions that had been haunting her for so long. One evening, as they set up camp beneath a canopy of stars, Rae and Silas found themselves alone by the fire. "You've been quiet," Rae remarked, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames. Silas hesitated before responding. "Just thinking." About how you never told me your real name." Rae met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Does it matter?" "Maybe." There was a long pause before Rae spoke again. "I'm not the person I was before. That woman is gone." Silas studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I get that." The fire crackled between them, the only sound in the stillness of the desert night. The next day, they arrived at the research facility. It was a stark contrast to the barren landscape surrounding it, modern, well-maintained, and eerily quiet. Rae led the way inside, her movements purposeful. Inside, the facility was a maze of sterile white corridors and locked doors. Rae navigated them with ease, stopping at a terminal to input a code. The door slid open with a soft hiss. Inside, the room was filled with monitors and equipment, all powered down. Rae moved to a desk and began sifting through papers. Silas watched her for a moment before speaking. "What are you looking for?" "Answers," she replied without looking up. As she flipped through a folder, a name caught her eye. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Silas stepped closer, peering over her shoulder. "What is it?" Rae turned the page to reveal a photograph. It was of a younger version of herself, standing beside a man who looked strikingly familiar. "That's me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And that's Callan." Silas's heart skipped a beat. The man in the photo was none other than his father. The revelation hit them both hard. Rae and Silas were mother and son, separated at birth, with their memories erased as part of a covert operation. The facility had been conducting experiments on memory manipulation, and they had been subjects. As the truth unfolded, so did the implications. Their shared history, their connection had been hidden from them for years, but the past couldn't be changed. All they had now was the present, and the uncertain future ahead. The room fell into a heavy silence as Rae stared at the photograph in her hands. The image, slightly faded, depicted a younger version of herself standing beside a man whose features bore a striking resemblance to Silas. Her fingers trembled as she traced the outlines, memories long buried surfacing with a sudden clarity. Silas stood beside her, his eyes fixed on the photograph. "That's him," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "That's my father." Rae nodded slowly, the weight of the revelation pressing down on her. "And I'm your mother," she whispered, the words tasting foreign yet familiar. The air between them thickened with unspoken emotions, shock, confusion, a burgeoning sense of connection. Silas stepped back, his mind racing to piece together the fragments of his past. The realization that the woman he had journeyed with, trusted and fought alongside was his mother sent a jolt through him. "I don't understand," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Why didn't I know? Why didn't you tell me?" Rae's eyes filled with tears as she struggled to find the right words. "I didn't know either," she confessed. "They took you from me, erased our memories. I thought you were gone forever." Silas turned away, grappling with a whirlwind of emotions. The room, once a sterile repository of forgotten research, now felt like a tomb of lost time and stolen identities. They spent the next few days in the facility, sifting through documents, piecing together the truth of their separation. The research detailed experiments on memory manipulation, the erasure of familial bonds in the name of scientific advancement. Each page they uncovered added another layer to their shared history, a tapestry woven with threads of pain, resilience, and an unbreakable bond. During this time, their interactions were marked by a tentative distance. Rae often found herself watching Silas from afar, noting the familiar tilt of his head, the way his brow furrowed in concentration, traits he had inherited from her. Silas, in turn, observed Rae with a newfound curiosity, recognizing echoes of himself in her mannerisms. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden hue over the desolate landscape, Rae approached Silas. "I know this is a lot to take in," she began, her voice steady yet gentle. "But I want you to know that I'm here. We can face this together." Silas looked at her, the initial shock in his eyes replaced by a contemplative calm. "I need time," he admitted, "but I want to understand. I want to know who we were, who we are." They sat in silence, the vastness of the desert stretching out before them, a testament to the journey they had undertaken and the one that lay ahead. In the days that followed, Rae and Silas began to bridge the chasm between them. They shared stories, memories resurfacing with each passing conversation. Laughter mingled with tears as they recounted moments from their fragmented pasts, finding solace in the rediscovery of their bond. Their relationship, once defined by camaraderie forged in adversity, now deepened with the understanding of their true connection. Trust, though tested, began to rebuild, laying the foundation for a future shaped by shared experiences and a renewed sense of purpose. As they prepared to leave the facility, the weight of the past still lingered, but it no longer anchored them. Instead, it served as a reminder of their resilience and the strength of the ties that bound them. Together, Rae and Silas stepped into the unknown, not just as companions, but as mother and son, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The sterile light of the research facility flickered overhead as Rae, Silas, and Eric sifted through the dusty documents strewn across the metal table. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper and the weight of unspoken truths. Rae's hands trembled slightly as she opened a worn folder, revealing a photograph of herself cradling a newborn. Beside the image, a birth certificate bore the name Callan Rae. Her breath caught in her throat. Silas leaned in, his eyes scanning the document. "Callan Rae," he read aloud, the name foreign yet oddly familiar. He looked up at Rae, confusion etched on his face. "That's your name," Rae whispered, her voice barely audible. "Your real name." Silas stepped back, the revelation hitting him like a tidal wave. The identity he had known all his life was now a facade, a construct of manipulated memories. Eric, who had been silently observing, placed a reassuring hand on Silas's shoulder. "This place," he said, gesturing around the room, "was involved in some deep experiments. memory alteration, identity suppression. It's possible they changed your name as part of their protocols." Silas nodded slowly, the pieces of his fragmented past beginning to align. "So I'm Callan Rae," he murmured, testing the name on his tongue. Rae reached out, her hand gently clasping his. "Yes," she affirmed, tears welling in her eyes. "And I'm your mother." The room fell into a heavy silence, the gravity of the moment settling over them. Eric stepped back, giving them space, his presence a silent pillar of support. In the days that followed, the trio delved deeper into the facility's archives, uncovering more about the experiments that had upended their lives. Eric's technical expertise proved invaluable, deciphering complex data and piecing together the timeline of events. As they worked, the bond between Rae and Silas, now Callan, strengthened. Shared stories, mutual understanding, and the unearthing of their intertwined pasts forged a connection that transcended the years lost. Eric, ever the steadfast companion, remained by their side, his quiet presence a constant reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. As time passed, the bond between Rae and Eric deepened, blossoming into a love neither had anticipated. Their shared experiences and mutual respect laid the foundation for a partnership rooted in trust and understanding. Eventually they married, solidifying their commitment to one another. Eric embraced his role as Callan's stepfather with compassion and dedication. He offered the support and guidance that Callan had long been denied, helping him navigate the complexities of his newfound identity. Together they faced the shadows of their past, determined to reclaim their identities and chart a new course forward as a family.